The man who served time for his crime, then had to save his life. A story of justice, redemption, and the unexpected bonds that form when two strangers discover their darkest secrets. The rain hammered against the windshield of Marcus Williams' 15-year-old Honda Civic as he pulled into the parking lot of St. Catherine's emergency room. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, and the fluorescent lights of the hospital cut through the darkness like a beacon he never wanted to see again. But the man slumped unconscious in his passenger seat didn't give him a choice. Marcus killed the engine and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Hospitals meant questions. Questions meant background checks. Background checks meant someone would discover that Marcus Williams, 42, was an ex-convict who had spent the last 12 years in Millbrook Correctional Facility for armed robbery and aggravated assault. Charges he hadn't committed. A crime he'd never been near. A life sentence that had been reduced to 12 years on a technicality, but 12 years too many for an innocent man. He looked at the stranger beside him, a white man about his own age, well-dressed despite the blood soaking through his expensive shirt. 20 minutes ago, Marcus had been driving home from his night shift at Rodriguez Auto Repair, trying to make it through another day in a world that saw his face and immediately assumed the worst. 20 minutes ago, he'd been just another ex-con trying to rebuild a life from the ashes of a justice system that had failed him spectacularly. Now he was faced with a choice that would define what kind of man he'd become after 12 years of caged rage and bitter disappointment. The man in the passenger seat groaned, his head lolling forward. Blood dripped from a gash on his forehead onto his designer jeans. Marcus had found him on Route 47, about 3 miles outside of town, stumbling along the shoulder of the road in a daze. No other cars around. No explanation for how he'd gotten there or what had happened to him. Marcus had pulled over without thinking. Maybe it was muscle memory from his days before prison, when he'd been a different person with a different life. Maybe it was just basic human decency reasserting itself after years of suppression. Either way, he was here now, and the man was bleeding. Marcus pushed open his door and walked around to the passenger side, the rain immediately soaking through his work shirt. He half-carried, half-dragged the injured man toward the emergency room entrance, ignoring the curious looks from the night staff who were clearly wondering why a black man in coveralls was bringing in what looked like a banker who'd been in a car accident. The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical whoosh, and Marcus found himself in the sterile brightness of the emergency room waiting area. A heavy-set nurse with kind eyes and graying hair looked up from her computer terminal. "What happened?" she asked, already reaching for a wheelchair. "Found him on Route 47, Marcus said simply. "He's been unconscious on and off. Looks like a head injury." The nurse, her name tag read Dorothy, helped Marcus get the man into the wheelchair. As she did, the man's wallet fell from his jacket pocket, spilling its contents across the floor. Marcus knelt to gather the scattered cards and cash, his eyes involuntarily scanning the driver's license that had landed face up near his feet. Thomas Edward Brennan. Age 44. Address on Maple Street, the rich part of town where Marcus would never be able to afford to live. But it wasn't the address that made Marcus freeze. It was the face in the license photo, 10 years younger and without the lines of stress and alcohol that now marked it, but unmistakably familiar. Marcus's hands began to shake as he stared at the license. The face that had haunted his dreams for 12 years. The face he'd seen in court, sitting in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table, nodding with satisfaction as the guilty verdict was read. The face of the man who had actually committed the crime that had sent Marcus to prison. Thomas Brennan, the real armed robber who had held up Patterson's liquor store on March 15, 2012, pistol-whipped the elderly owner, and gotten away with $340 and a bottle of whiskey. The man whose general description had matched Marcus well enough for a desperate police department to build a case around coincidence and circumstantial evidence. Marcus had been 3 blocks away at a job interview when the robbery occurred. But he was a black man with a minor record, some bar fights in his 20s, a DUI from his early 30s, and Thomas Brennan was a white insurance salesman with a clean record and a drinking problem no one wanted to acknowledge. The victim, Harold Patterson, had been knocked unconscious and couldn't identify his attacker clearly. The store's security camera had been broken for 2 months. The only witness was a passerby who'd seen a tall black man running from the scene, a description that could have fit half the men in town, but somehow only fit Marcus when the police needed it to. Thomas Brennan had sat in that courtroom every day of the trial, probably congratulating himself on his incredible luck. He'd committed a violent crime and watched an innocent man pay the price for it. Now that same man was unconscious and bleeding, completely at Marcus's mercy. "Sir." Dorothy's voice cut through Marcus's paralysis. "Sir, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Marcus carefully placed the license and other cards back in the wallet, his mind racing. He could walk away right now. Just disappear into the night and let Thomas Brennan face whatever consequences had led to him stumbling bloodied along a dark highway. It would be justice of a sort. Cosmic payback for 12 years of stolen life. But as Marcus looked at the unconscious man's face, something else stirred in his chest. Not compassion exactly, but a recognition of shared humanity that prison had tried but failed to beat out of him. "I'm fine," Marcus told Dorothy. "Just tired. Long night." She nodded sympathetically. "We'll take good care of him. You did the right thing bringing him in." "The right thing?" Marcus almost laughed at the irony. A doctor appeared, young, efficient, already asking questions about the patient's condition and medical history. Marcus answered what little he could, leaving out the part about recognizing the man who had destroyed his life. As they wheeled Thomas Brennan toward the treatment area, Marcus found himself following, drawn by a mixture of morbid curiosity and something deeper he couldn't quite name. "Are you family?" a nurse asked as they reached the restricted area. Marcus hesitated. "Friend," he said finally. It wasn't exactly a lie. They weren't strangers anymore, even if Thomas didn't know it yet. The next hour passed in a blur of medical activity. Thomas had suffered a severe concussion and several broken ribs, likely from a car accident, though there was no sign of his vehicle. He'd been incredibly lucky that Marcus had found him when he did. Lucky. The word tasted bitter in Marcus's mouth. Around 4:30 a.m., Thomas finally began to stir. Marcus watched from a chair beside the hospital bed as the man who had stolen his life slowly returned to consciousness. Where am I?" Thomas's voice was hoarse, confused. "St. Catherine's Hospital," Marcus said quietly. "You were injured. I found you on Route 47 and brought you in." Thomas turned his head carefully, wincing at the movement. When his eyes focused on Marcus's face, there was no recognition there. Just the polite confusion of a man trying to piece together a traumatic evening. "Thank you," Thomas said simply. I don't remember what happened. Was it a car accident?" Marcus studied the man's face for any sign of deception, any hint that he remembered the trial, the sentencing, the life he'd helped destroy. But there was nothing. Just genuine gratitude from a stranger who didn't know he was talking to his victim. "Probably," Marcus replied. "You were pretty banged up when I found you." Over the next few hours, as Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness and the doctors ran their tests, Marcus learned more about the man he'd spent 12 years hating. The nurses chatted as they worked, and from their conversations, Marcus pieced together a picture of Thomas Brennan's life since that day in court. He'd lost his job at the insurance company within a year of Marcus's conviction. Drinking on the job, they whispered. His wife had divorced him 2 years later. He'd been living alone in a rundown apartment, struggling with alcoholism and what one of the nurses described as severe depression and anxiety. Not exactly the victorious life Marcus had imagined for the man who'd escaped justice. When morning came, Thomas was lucid enough for a real conversation. Marcus had spent the night in the uncomfortable hospital chair, telling himself he was just waiting to make sure the man survived. The truth was more complicated. "I keep feeling like I should know you," Thomas said, studying Marcus's face with puzzled intensity. "Have we met before?" Marcus felt his heartbeat accelerate. "I don't think so." Thomas winced as he shifted position. "Well, either way, I owe you my life. The doctor said if you hadn't found me when you did." He trailed off, then looked directly at Marcus. "What's your name? I want to make sure I can thank you properly when I get out of here." This was the moment Marcus had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The moment of truth that would define everything that came after. "Marcus Williams," he said quietly. Thomas's face went completely white. Even through the bruises and bandages, the shock was unmistakable. "Marcus Williams," Thomas repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Oh God! Oh Jesus Christ!" The two men stared at each other across the hospital bed. 12 years of history suddenly present in the room like a third person neither wanted to acknowledge. "You know who I am," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. Thomas closed his eyes tightly, as if he could make the moment disappear through sheer force of will. When he opened them again, there were tears streaming down his cheeks. "I sat in that courtroom every day," Thomas whispered. "Every single day of your trial. I told myself I was just interested in the case. Concerned citizen and all that." He swallowed hard. "But I knew. God help me. I knew what I'd done to you." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. Not relief, not yet, but a kind of validation he'd been seeking for over a decade. "Why?" Marcus asked, his voice steady despite the emotion churning inside him. "Why didn't you speak up? Why did you let me go to prison for your crime?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, tears still flowing freely. "Because I was a coward," he said finally. "Because I was drunk and scared and I told myself that maybe they'd got the right guy anyway. Maybe you'd done something else and this was just cosmic justice." He looked directly at Marcus, his eyes red but unflinching. "Because I was weak and selfish and I destroyed an innocent man's life to save my own skin. And I've been living with that knowledge every day since." Marcus absorbed this confession, feeling the weight of 12 years of anger and bitterness shifting in his chest like tectonic plates finding new equilibrium. "Is that why you've been drinking yourself to death?" Marcus asked. Thomas's bitter laugh turned into a cough. "Drinking. Pills. I tried hanging myself last year, but I was too much of a coward for that too." He gestured weakly at his hospital gown. "Last night, I was driving home from another bar, another attempt to drink away what I'd done. I was going to drive straight into that oak tree on Morrison Bridge. End it all finally." Marcus felt his breath catch. "What stopped you?" "I chickened out at the last second. Swerved. Lost control. Went off the road and hit that concrete barrier." Thomas's voice was flat, matter of fact. "Even trying to kill myself, I screwed it up. Just like everything else." The irony was almost overwhelming. The man whose crime had destroyed Marcus's life had been trying to destroy his own life, and Marcus, the victim, had saved him from the consequences. "The doctor says you stayed here all night," Thomas continued. "You could have just dropped me off and left. Why didn't you?" Marcus had been asking himself the same question for hours. Why had he stayed? Why was he still here, talking to the man who'd stolen 12 years of his life? "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "Maybe I needed to understand. Maybe I needed to hear you say it." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of their shared history settling between them like dust after an explosion. "What happens now?" Thomas asked eventually. It was a fair question. Marcus could go to the police, present evidence of Thomas's confession. Maybe get his conviction overturned officially instead of just knowing in his heart that he'd been innocent. He could sue Thomas for damages, though the man clearly had nothing left to take. He could also walk away and never see Thomas Brennan again. Let the man live with his guilt and his self-destruction while Marcus focused on building the life he should have had all along. Or he could do something else entirely. "I've been thinking about that," Marcus said slowly, "and I think we both need to make some changes." Over the next 2 hours, as the hospital bustled with morning activity around them, Marcus Williams and Thomas Brennan had the most important conversation of either man's life. Marcus talked about prison. Not the Hollywood version with dramatic escapes and noble inmates, but the grinding reality of lost time, lost opportunities, lost relationships. He talked about his mother dying while he was locked up, about missing his nephew's childhood, about the way potential employers' faces changed when they saw his record. But he also talked about the unexpected gifts of that terrible time. The books he'd read, hundreds of them, everything from philosophy to auto repair manuals. The GED he'd earned, then the associate's degree through the prison education program. The anger management classes that had taught him to channel his rage into something productive. Most importantly, he talked about the decision he'd made in his 8th year of incarceration, that he would not let what had happened to him define the rest of his life, that he would emerge from prison as a better man than he'd been when he went in, not despite the injustice he'd suffered, but because of how he chose to respond to it. Thomas, in turn, talked about his own prison, the one constructed from guilt and alcohol and self-hatred. He talked about losing his job, his family, his self-respect. About the nights he'd driven past Marcus's old apartment building, wondering what the innocent man he'd helped convict was experiencing behind bars. He talked about the suicide attempts, the failed rehabilitation programs, the way guilt had eaten away at him like cancer until there was almost nothing left of the man he'd once been. "I used to think," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion, "that if I punished myself enough, if I suffered enough, somehow that would balance the scales. But it doesn't work that way, does it? My suffering doesn't undo yours." "No," Marcus agreed. "It doesn't. So what do we do? How do we fix this?" Marcus had been thinking about that question all night, and the answer he'd arrived at surprised even him. "We help each other," he said simply. Thomas stared at him in amazement. "After everything I've done to you, you'd help me?" "Not for you," Marcus clarified. "For me. Because holding on to this anger and hatred, it's like staying in prison even after they let me out. And I'm tired of being locked up." What Marcus proposed was unconventional, probably unprecedented, and definitely complicated. But it was also, he thought, possibly the only path forward for both of them. Thomas would get clean. Real clean, with professional help and a genuine commitment to recovery. He would turn himself in to the police and confess to the robbery that had sent Marcus to prison. He would cooperate fully with efforts to overturn Marcus's conviction and clear his record. In return, Marcus would help him through the recovery process. Not as a friend, they would probably never be friends, but as someone who understood what it meant to rebuild a life from nothing. Someone who knew how to turn rock bottom into a foundation instead of a grave. "You'd do that?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible. "After what I did to you?" "I'm not doing it for what you did," Marcus replied. "I'm doing it despite what you did. Because that's who I choose to be." Thomas was quiet for a long time, processing the magnitude of what Marcus was offering and what it would require of him in return. "If I confess," Thomas said finally, "I'll go to prison, probably for a long time." "Yes," Marcus agreed. "You will. And you'd help me prepare for that? Even knowing that I deserve whatever happens to me." Marcus thought about the question carefully. Did Thomas deserve to suffer? Absolutely. Had his 12 years of guilt and self-destruction been adequate punishment? Probably not. But Marcus had learned something in prison that he couldn't have learned anywhere else. That justice wasn't just about punishment. Real justice was about restoration, about making things as right as they could be made, about creating a future that was better than the past. "I'll help you," Marcus said finally, "because helping you helps me heal, and because two broken men might be able to build one decent life between them." 6 months later, Marcus Williams walked out of the courthouse in Springfield, his conviction officially overturned and his record expunged. The local newspaper had covered the story. Innocent man's 12-year ordeal ends with surprising twist, but Marcus avoided the reporters waiting on the courthouse steps. He had more important things to do. Thomas Brennan had been sentenced to 8 years in Millbrook Correctional Facility, the same prison where Marcus had served his time. The judge had taken Thomas's voluntary confession and cooperation into account, but 8 years was still 8 years. Marcus visited him every month, not out of friendship, but out of a commitment to see this through to the end. They talked about books, about recovery, about what Thomas might do with his life when he got out. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. Marcus wasn't sure he would ever fully forgive what Thomas had done to him. But it was something else, something he was still learning to understand. It was choosing to break the cycle, choosing to respond to injustice with justice, to hatred with something that wasn't quite love but wasn't hate either. It was choosing to be free. On the drive home from his first visit to Thomas in prison, Marcus stopped at St. Catherine's Hospital. Dorothy, the night nurse, was just starting her shift. "Marcus," she called out when she saw him. "How are you doing? I saw the news about your case. I'm so happy they finally got it right." "Thanks, Dorothy. Actually, I wanted to ask you something." Marcus pulled a business card from his wallet. "Marcus Williams, certified auto mechanic and recovery counselor. I'm starting a program to help ex-convicts find work and housing when they get out. I was wondering if the hospital might have any positions available. Nothing glamorous, but honest work for people who need a second chance." Dorothy smiled and took the card. "I think we might be able to work something out. After all, you showed us what kind of man you are that night you brought Thomas in. This place could use more people like you." As Marcus walked back to his car, he thought about the strange turns his life had taken. 12 years ago, he'd been an innocent man sent to prison for someone else's crime. 6 months ago, he'd been an ex-con struggling to rebuild his life from nothing. Today, he was a free man in every sense of the word. Not because his conviction had been overturned, but because he'd chosen to break free from the prison of anger and bitterness that could have consumed him. Thomas Brennan had taken 12 years of his life, but Marcus Williams had taken something back that was worth more than time. He'd taken back his humanity. And sometimes, in a world full of injustice and pain, that was the closest thing to victory a man could ask for. The rain had stopped, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus Williams felt like he could see clearly through the windshield ahead. He had somewhere to go, something to do, and someone to become. And that, he thought as he drove home through the quiet streets of his town, was more than enough. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment. Sometimes it's about finding the strength to help the person who hurt you heal themselves. Sometimes the greatest victory is not in defeating your enemy, but in refusing to become what they were at their worst.